Well, let me say welcome to Socrates in the City, Oxford edition. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't know that the English were capable of such enthusiasm. I thank you for surprising me. This is really such a joy for me to be here. Many of you are familiar with Socrates in the City. You know that we've done them throughout the United States, mostly in New York City. Never here in merry old England. It struck me that most of the people that I wanted to interview, but that's an exaggeration, many of the people I wanted to interview were here in Oxford. And I thought if we did it here, it would be very easy. We could just sort of set up and do a number of these. But I'll tell you a secret. We would not have done any of these. We're doing 8 sessions. We wouldn't have done any of them if this morning's guest, Mr. Walter Hooper, had declined. Because as far as I was concerned, this was the most important one. This was the one that I wanted most to do. And I'll tell you why. And this explains really why I'm so excited. This is a dream come true for me, actually, because it struck me a number of years ago that there were several people out there whom no one had invited to do a TV chat show kind of thing. They hadn't been able to tell their stories in that format. So there are audio tapes here and there and different things, and there are interviews you can read. But I thought, can it be possible that Walter Hooper, of all people, has not been sat down to have a proper conversation about his life and the gigantic influence he has had? I mean, it's actually more than gigantic. It's dispositive, would be a good William F. Buckley word, on the legacy of C.S. Lewis. It's outrageous. And so I think the side of me that's annoyed by injustice says, somebody's got to do this. This is absurd. Maybe I could do it. What a thrill that would be. What a dream it would be. And so it's been a long time in coming. I first had this ambition, I remember distinctly, I guess it was the second trimester of my mother's pregnancy with me in 1963, early 63. I knew that I wanted to do this. But I really wanted to do this for a long time. So I can't believe that we're here, that Mr. Hooper has consented. It's just a thrill for me that we're finally going to do this, and it's particularly thrilling that you've given me this much time. Because as I spoke with Walter Hooper last year, I realized there are so many stories. It's not like a typical Socrates event where you can sort of do it and you're done. It's about a book or something like that. It's about the lifetime of C.S. Lewis. It's about his entire oeuvre, his body of work, and about how Walter Hooper has magnificently and utterly uniquely played a role in bringing C.S. Lewis to the world. So someone who's a devotee and lover of C.S. Lewis and his works, I couldn't be happier. So in just a moment, I'll a little bit more properly introduce Mr. Walter Hooper. Before we go on, we've got a number of sponsors who've made this possible. I want to thank them. My friend Barbara Bryant of St. Louis, our friends Laura and David Thayer of Philadelphia, Lisa and Kenny Trout of Dallas, Sharon Vanderpaul of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and our dear friends Susie and Jerry Wilson also of Dallas. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. I also want to thank the NRB Network and Jerry Johnson, who is here, for making this possible. We are going to air all of these on the NRB Network. Really, really excited. If you're watching on the NRB Network, hi. And I want, last but not even close to least, my chief of staff and friend, Alyssa Laberis, who's sitting here in the front row, who has done so much work that I try not to think about it, because it would just embarrass me that anybody working with me would do this much work. But this has been months in the making. So Alyssa, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Where are the flowers? No. You can take those. We really, we all know that this has been, it's been a long time in coming. So this is a great, great treat for me. So just a few words. There's really not much to say about Walter Hooper because it all sounds insignificant compared to what it is that I think makes him significant. But the little factoids are that he's an author, of course, and a trustee of the literary estate of C.S. Lewis. These are some important facts. He was born in Reidsville, North Carolina in 1931, served in the U.S. Army for 2 years, earned his master's in education in 1958, and taught English at the University of Kentucky in the early 1960s. After he'd corresponded with C.S. Lewis for a number of years, starting with his time in the Army, he was able to visit C.S. Lewis in England, where the great C.S. Lewis, the legend, asked Walter Hooper to stay with him at the Kilns, at his home, as secretary. So following Lewis's death, which actually was just a few months later, Walter Hooper worked with Lewis's dear friend, fellow Inkling Owen Barfield, really to organize and preserve Lewis's rather vast works. So many essays and writings, and of course letters. We can talk about that as well. He became friends with a number of the Inklings, most of whom were living at that time, including Tolkien, Charles Williams, and of course Owen Barfield. Mr. Hooper was ordained as an Anglican priest and was the chaplain, in fact, of 2 Oxford colleges and served as assistant rector of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Oxford. Walter Hooper converted to Catholicism in 1988. We have so much to talk about, so I'd better shut up and just say, please give a warm Socrates in the City Oxford edition welcome to Mr. Walter Hooper. Well, probably the best thing I can say is I have no idea where to start. So in lieu of a bright idea, I'll start at the beginning. If you would, tell us your story and how it is that you came to meet Lewis and to work with him.
I was in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in 1953, before any of you were born. Anyway, at that time, it's not generally known now, but the Korean crisis was going on. You know, America had not quite pulled out of Korea. And so all the young men were being drafted. And I was begging my draft board to give me just a few more months. And during those last few months, someone introduced me to a book called Letters to Young Churches by J.B. Phillips, which had an introduction by Lewis. It was an introduction which absolutely changed my life. I've never heard such a voice of faith in my life. And I kept saying to other people, this man really believes. And they said, but all the believers believe. And I said, no, this is different. And I've been thinking about that since all those years. And I think what I would say, it was different because Lewis believed with the confidence, I think, that you would find in St. Peter and St. Paul. He would have tested everything against this. He knew it in a way that we just don't know things today. Anyway, I was going into the army, straight into the army, and I thought, if only I could get a book by Lewis. Unfortunately, that Chapel Hill didn't have his books in stock at that time. But anyway, in Greensboro, there were 2 elderly women, the Strong sisters, who liked to put the book, a right book, in the right hands. So they produced a copy of Miracles. Anyway, this was basic training, and you don't have places you can store things, you know. So I kept it inside my shirt, this hardback book. And so during calisthenics and all of that, it was jumping up and down with me. But so far, none of the sergeants discovered that. Even, you know, climbing under barbed wire. But the book made such a huge impression on me that every 10 minutes there would be a cigarette break, you know. So you could stop that and then assemble you again and, you know, after 10 minutes. But I used those 10 minutes sitting under a pine tree. I think I could recognize the pine tree I was sitting under when I read that wonderful book. It really just changed my life. I've read it many times since then. And I knew I had made a huge discovery, you know, larger than anything I would have expected to happen in my whole life.
You were really, at that point, it seems to me, before you got the Miracles book, looking for anything by Lewis, or were you specifically looking for miracles?
Oh, no, anything.
Anything. In other words, you read this introduction in the J.B. Phillips translation, and by the way, Lewis was a real encouragement to Phillips in writing that great translation. Were you aware at that point of who Lewis was and of his other works, or were you just waiting for these sisters in the Greensboro bookstore to get you something by Lewis? What did you know about Lewis at that point?
I knew almost nothing except that the captain of the football team at the University of North Carolina, he had mentioned the Screwtape Letters, but I didn't see it at that time.
Okay, so that was out in '53, the Screwtape Letters.
It came out in 1942.
Oh.
You know. And, but I mean, this was '53 that I'm talking about.
Okay.
But no, I didn't know what other books
so
were.
You just rather randomly received this copy of Miracles, because I'm thinking of all the books of Lewis that I have loved, that's one that I didn't love. I mean, I guess I find it rather difficult reading.
Yes.
But when you're in basic training, I guess you'll take what you can get. And it is of course, great, but it takes more effort than some of his other books. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was happy to take that effort. I remember one of the sergeants saw me reading that, and he said, "Soldier, you better really ought to be reading a work on Korean, learning Korean." But one of the things I'm really glad about, unlike you, so you can go to a bookshop like Blackwell's or maybe even here, and you can say they have the Chronicles of Nárnia, and they have the theological works like Christianity and so on, and then there's his literary criticism. I didn't know about these different categories, and I'm glad I didn't, because he didn't like being known as several authors, but as one author of many different types. So the books came to me in a very higgledy-piggledy order. I think one of the first ones was, in fact, the Arthurian Torso, which was a work by Charles Williams with a commentary on his poems by C.S. Lewis.
Which one was that? Arthurian?
Arthurian Torso.
Torso.
1947. And then came English literature in the 16th century, which I loved. And then came Screwtape Letters, and then The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which hadn't long been out. So they came, you know, but I could hear the voice of C.S. Lewis in each of those, you know. The same, you know, siren voice that had reached me from Miracles. In his reply to me, and I didn't expect a reply, he said, "Even at our sins, we should look no longer than to know and repent them, but they're not a proper object of contemplation. When a man comes under the divine meridian, he loses his consciousness of self, and in the end becomes a creature which fills other people's lives, while they in turn help fill our lives. But how far from this one is at present?" He entered so deeply into other people's lives that for a while I wondered, before I met him, is there any C.S. Lewis left if he's so spread out in other people's lives and other people are so influential to him? Well, I was to find that out later.
That's extraordinary, what you're telling us, that he takes the trouble not just to reply, but to reply sensitively and in some depth. That's hard to believe.
Well, as I later discovered, he believed that if you write a book, you can write, anybody can write a book if they want to, but if you publish a book and you sell it and people buy it, you have responsibility to those people who write to you. You didn't have to do that. You, in one way, asked for that, and you all for being paid for it as well. So you must reply to people. He took them seriously. Anyway, he replied by writing in ink with his hand, and he replied by return of post, which in this country means the same, you write the same day you get the other person's letter. So he wrote enormous numbers of letters. But I mean, when you look at the quality of the letters, you realize he really did answer what I had said to him. Anyway, I liked him even more as a man. And from that time on, after reading 6 or 7 of his books and waiting to read them, it made the army one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. I hated to leave, when my 2 years, 4 days, and 1 breakfast were concluded. Anyway, I ended up, shortly after that, teaching in the University of Kentucky. And I had a chance to write a book about Lewis for the Twain's English Author Series. So I wrote to him about that. We'd already exchanged a good many letters. And he said, it's far better to write about the unanswering dead, because they can't blow the gaff on all the mistakes you make. But if you insist, go ahead and write it. But if you like to, I'll see you if you come to Oxford. So I went to Oxford.
What year was this?
1963.
63.
And I had an appointment with him at the Kilns, his house about 4.5 miles away, on Monday, the 10th of June, 1963. And I'd only just got here. I had not any idea that in English homes, at that time at least, the bathroom and the lavatory were separate rooms. Anyway, I went out on Friday, as a friend told me, so you should find out where he lives. It'd be a pity if, you miss seeing him on Monday because you simply couldn't find the house. Well, nobody in the street knew where he lived. So finally somebody said his housekeeper lives in number 11, Kiln Lane. So she told me, the housekeeper, how to get to it. And she said, he's down now. At 4 o'clock he will be having tea. So go on up. So I did. And I rang the doorbell. And then, I don't know whether you've had these experiences, but they happen to me pretty often. I suddenly saw myself for what I was. Ignorant beside him. And a Tar Heel, North Carolina. What was I doing bothering this man? And I just wish there had been a hole big enough to just hold me and drop me into it. I really wanted to flee.
Even though he invited you?
Even though he'd invited me. But I assumed this would be just the one chance I would have to see him, the one chance. So I really, when he invited me in, well, I thought, this is what I've wanted for years and years, And he could not have been nicer. The talk was exciting because everything was a kind of disputation with him, because you were always talking towards truth. For instance, I remember during the conversation we had, he made a very important distinction, as he does in his books. I asked him, which of your books do you think best? And he said, I think Perelandra is best. And then he asked me, which of my books do you like the most? And feeling that we were talking about the same thing, I said, well, I agree with you. I agree with you, Perelandra is best. He said, no, you asked me which is best. I'm asking you which you like the most. And I said, the one I like more than any book in the entire world is That Hideous Strength. He said, so do I. But don't you see, they're different. You might find one thing far better than another, but you might really like something else better.
It's like, I guess it was like sitting with the old knock
Yeah, I think so.
Right?
Yeah,
And you have to explain that was Lewis's tutor. I can't remember when he was, what, 15 years old?
Yep, yes. Mm-hmm. And he was always, in one way, saying, why do you say that? Do you even know what you're talking about?
In other words, even the difference, the distinction between what do you think is my best book and which book do you like the best are two different questions.
Yeah, they are.
That's a fact, but most people wouldn't make that distinction, but when you're sitting with C.S. Lewis, he did make it. So here you are with him for the first time, and he's having a wonderful conversation with you, but it's interesting that he doesn't relax that way he has of forcing his interlocutor, I guess, to think hard. So you say That Hideous Strength, and then strangely enough, he says that's also the book that he likes best.
From the moment I got there, he brought in a pot of tea. And I love tea very, very much. Not coffee, but tea. And he was a gargantuan tea drinker. After we finished one pot, he went in the kitchen and brought back a second pot, and then a third pot. By this time, I must have had 12 cups.
12 cups of tea.
I was very uncomfortable. Like most Americans, I didn't know that they had two different rooms, you know, the bathroom and the lavatory. So I said, Professor Lewis, do you think I could use the bathroom? He said, certainly. So he took me to what was just the bathroom. It had a bathtub in it. And he took out about 4 towels and put them there beside the bath. Took 4 tablets of soap and put them beside the
4 tablets of soap. He's having a little fun with the Tar Heel.
So then he closed the door. He said, do you think you have enough for a bath? And I said, I'm sure I will. And so he closed the door. So
he closed the door and you didn't object. You just...
I had a very anxious about 2 or 3 minutes, wondering what to do in the bathroom.
Don't you wish that you had taken a bath?
Well, I was too uncomfortable for that. So I went back into the common room where he was, and I said, Professor Lewis, actually it wasn't a bath I wanted. And he said, he was laughing. He said, that will cure you of those American euphemisms. Now, let's start over again. Where do you want to go?
Now, if we're going to play that game 50 years later, 52 years later, I want to throw it right back at Lewis, but I'll throw it back at you. Lavatory, obviously, the etymology of that has nothing to do with flushing a toilet.
I know. Yeah,
so therefore, isn't that equally wrong and an equally bad British euphemism for toilet?
I thought so, but I wouldn't dare say it to him.
Oh, you... Okay. So he was a jokester.
Well, he was a man who knew language and who was interested in language. And he told me that right before that, beautiful American girl of long blonde hair had been entertained by these 2 elderly ladies who were his neighbors. They commented on her beautiful blonde hair. How do you make it so beautiful, they asked. They were in their 90s. And she said, I wash my hair every day in the lavatory. Well, they said to him, we never want her back again. This is the rudest girl we've ever met. So he was already primed to
But think of the results she was getting. Wow. Okay.
Well, finally about 2 hours after that, it was time for me to go, and he took me to the bus stop, which was also where the Ampleforth Arms, his pub, local pub.
Oh, by the pub. Yeah.
So we went in and we had a pint of beer together, and then the bus came. And my heart was breaking. I remember in the short journey to the bus stop, regretting that I'd even met him because I liked him so much. I remember thinking, I really love this man. And I thought this was it, you know. And I thought might have been better never to have met him than to taste that wonderful personality and then give it up forever. Anyway, so I was getting on the bus. I said, well, thank you very much, Professor Lewis. It's been very nice meeting you. He said, you're not getting away. Oh, no, you're not getting away. You're coming to the Inkling meeting on Monday. Well, the Inklings were at that time meeting just on Mondays because Lewis had been gone. Once he went to Cambridge, they had to change that because he went to Cambridge on Monday afternoon. So it had been on Tuesday for many years, but it changed.
So this is at lunch?
Oh, well, they started at about 11 o'clock drinking beer.
I'm surprised, drinking beer. I'm surprised that the Inklings were meeting as late as 1963. I hadn't realized that it went on so long.
They continued throughout the rest of his life. You know? Oh, no, he loved the Inkling meetings, you know. And they were meeting at that time, they had been for this last several years, in the Lamb and Flag, which is across from the Bird and the Baby. And there were eight.
What happened to make them quit the Bird and Baby?
Well, see, in the old days, the rabbit room which they met in was part of the publican's own territory. That was their sitting room. It wasn't part of the pub. It was part of where the publican lived. See,
the keeper of the pub was called the publican?
That's right. That's what they call him, you know. I know that sounds, but anyway, they still are.
I know they're sinners,
but anyway, the publican, Charles Blagrove, who had, let's said to them, have this room, you can meet him there. Okay,
so no one else was allowed to go in there. This was, they had the rabbit room where we can walk through now.
So nobody else would have gone in there because it was a private room.
It was a private room, okay.
So anyway, but he had died, and the new people, other publicans, had opened it up to everybody. Oh. So they wouldn't have had it privately, and they might not have been able to get in at all. So they were just having in the open room part of the pub of the Lamb and Flag. But it was all right. I mean, they liked that too. There were 8 people there, I remember, and one of those, who was an occasional visitor, was Lewis's friend, Roger Lancelin Green, who had a lot to do with the Nárnia stories, and whose books I had read and liked very much. And in his King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, he had made a great deal of the spiritual kingdom of Logres, it's called, in his Arthurian book. And I mentioned that Logres, the spiritual kingdom, which Lewis mentions in That Hideous Strength. Anyway, Lewis picked up what I said, and then it went like a ball, you know, around the room, and other people talked about it. He then asked me more questions, and I answered. He was a very easy man to talk with in these groups. He brought you out. Instead of making you feel small or ignorant or anything, he brought you out. He was like God, I think, in that way. He wanted you to shine. He really wanted the best of you to shine forth. You know? The curious thing was, he didn't do much talking himself, but he made good talk possible. I've never seen anybody who could bring you out more and make you shine. When I left that meeting, I thought, Walter Hooper, you are beginning to get intelligent, you know. And
who else was in that room? Was Tolkien there at that time?
No, his son, Christopher, was there.
His son was there. I'm trying to think who else. Owen Barfield, was he there?
No, he wasn't. You know. But John Walsh, the historian, was various other members, of the university, like Colin Hardy, was always there. Dr. Havard was his doctor, and several others. But it was a very lovely group. But Lewis made it possible. It made it work, Anyway, then I thought, I'm back to my old worries again. I won't see him anymore. This is it. I've had him at least 2 times, so I thought, well, I should be very grateful. Anyway, we stepped outside, and he leant down to give some money to this beggar who was sitting on the curb. And I'm ashamed that I said it, but I said the usual thing. I said to Lewis, aren't you afraid that this man will spend that money on drink? And he said, well, if I kept it, I would.
Wow.
And then after that, I started on my, well, thank you very much, Professor. He said, you're not getting away. You're not getting away. You're coming back to the Kills on Wednesday. And so...
And how did he know, how long were you planning to be in Oxford at that time?
A number of months.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he said, you're coming on Wednesday. And so Wednesday was a lovely day. I asked him what he did, for instance, that day, what he did with his manuscripts. And he said, well, he was always short of paper, and paper was valuable, he said, because of the war. And he said, when I write a book, say, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I turn it over, then I write another book on the back of that. And then he said, and then I throw it away. Well, what can I say? Stop. But I think he knew that I really did appreciate his writings and was sorry that he did that. But I didn't dare say anything. Anyway, then he said, well, you're not leaving because you're coming back on Sunday because we're going to church together and you're having breakfast there.
And you have what there?
Breakfast. He loved cooking breakfast himself.
Now, what do you think was behind this? Did he have a specific reason, or he just said, no, you must come back? What do you suppose was going on?
Well, I think he knew I liked him very much. And I had come a long way.
And he knew you were working on this book?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
That was very little was said about that. He may have liked me. I mean, this is an awful thing to say, and I apologize. I think of him as just being very good to me. But anyway, it was not very long after that we got into the habit of the 3 meetings a week. And then in early July, I went out one Sunday to find him. He was in his house coat, and he was trying to write a letter to the American lady, as she's been called. The letters to her were published as American Lady, Mrs. Shelburne. Anyway, who was a complaining person. Anyway, he could hardly push the pen across the paper. And he was going into the hospital. I didn't realize that he had problems. He had an affected kidney and an affected prostate gland, but he was too weak. His heart was too weak for an operation. Otherwise, it'd be very simple, and they would be, I think, in America now. But because they are feared to operate because of his heart, he was put on a low-protein diet, and occasionally, about once a month, he went into the hospital for blood transfusion.
Wow.
But he looked so well, you would have never guessed anything was wrong. Anyway, besides this, this problem, there is the problem of writing. He said, I'm getting rheumatism in my hand, and said, usually I have my brother to help me, who drives the typewriter.
Drives the typewriter.
Drives the typewriter, as they expressed it. So he said, but he's an alcoholic. He was at that point in Ireland, in Drogheda, where he'd been going since 1947, and he'd been away already for about 6 months. And so Lewis said, the thing is that I really need a secretary. Would you stop and live here with me and give up your job? And I said, yes. And anyway, he went into the hospital the next day. And then I had become friends with Austin Farrer and his wife, the warden of Keble. And I was with them when we heard that Lewis had had a heart attack and probably was dying. Anyway, after 3 days, we were still waiting by the telephone to hear he had died. But they rang to say, Professor Lewis has come out of his coma and is asking for his tea. So we hurried around to the hospital.
Do you remember what month this was?
This was in July.
July.
Austin Farrer said, you had us worried, Jack, He said, no, I don't think it can be said I was a very well man. But he said, Walter, I want you to arrive tomorrow morning early with pen and paper, because we got to get on with those letters. The letters were stacking up. So for the next 2 weeks, I went there and we worked all day. But one of the things I learned as beginning his work as his secretary was I had a lot of correspondence with his lawyer, Owen Barfield, whom you mentioned. Owen Barfield was very valuable to him in many, many ways. But in 1941, as Barfield explained to me, Lewis, that was the year of the Screwtape Letters. They were published separately in a magazine, church magazine, one at a time. And it was also in 1941 that he gave the first series of Mere Christianity broadcast. But rather than receive any of the money, Lewis sent both the BBC and the people who were publishing the Screwtape Letters a list of widows and orphans. Think of St. James's epistle. Widows and orphans, each of the fees were to be sent to a widow or an orphan. And at the end of the year, Lewis had to pay tax on all that money he'd given away, and he was really in a quandary. So he turned to Owen Barfield, and out of that debacle, what they did together was to set up a charitable organization called the Agape Fund, into which 2/3 of Lewis's total income went to be given anonymously to people in need, like widows and orphans. I couldn't believe that he put so much into it. When I thought about how poor the house was, when the housekeeper came down in 1952, she told me she still found the blackout curtains still up on the windows. Because, you don't want the Germans to see a light on. So you put blackout curtains, just this heavy black material.
1952.
52.
So
a
couple of bachelors living there too lazy to pull down the... That's amazing.
Well,
it's amazing.
No, he said, but why spend money on curtains, he said. He just didn't want to waste money on himself. She said, well, do you mind if I wash these blackout curtains? He said, go ahead. Well, she put them in soap and water, and they melted. They turned into ink. And, she poured them out.
They were probably so full of smoke that they were carcinogenic curtains.
Well, there was one ashtray in the house. Everybody smoked. When I first arrived there, I come from the tobacco town, and I gave him a carton of Lucky Strikes, which are good cigarettes, but strong. And then I thought, maybe he would like something with filters on them, then a pack of those, a carton of filtered cigarettes. he looked at those and he said, you know, my brother and I don't smoke cigarettes with contraceptives on them. You know? So he gave them away to his housekeeper. Anyway, when I thought, one ashtray, but I said, there's one ashtray. Can I get more ashtrays? He said, he always just flicked the ashes on the carpet. He said, you see, ashes are good for rugs, but only men believe it. Only men believe it. But anyway, I said to him, and really seriously, but Jack, why give away so much? And he took it really seriously, and he said, well, I thought God was so good in having me that the least I could do was to give part of back what I made in his service. And I thought, with shame, when was the last time I thought how good God is in having me? But he really had the temperament of a child Christian in a way. So gracious, so grateful that God would have him, you know. But that was part of that faith that he had. Anyway, when he came home, I thought this is going to be really difficult because I can't keep up the level of this wonderful conversation that he's good at all the time. But he didn't want to talk all the time either. And I discovered something, it may strike you as unusual or simple, but he liked, and I'm sure he did this with Warnie, he liked to sit quietly reading his book with another person. So he would say, as he picked up his book, Walter, didn't you bring your book? So he liked to just sit with somebody, not alone, but with somebody. And then if you had something to contribute, he might talk for a while and then go back to the books. Anyway, I found it extremely relaxing. I loved being there with him. But there were occasional mysteries. Like when I gave him a cup of coffee after lunch, I left him alone. I felt he needs to be alone now. So I closed the door, and I wondered, does he take a nap? But I tried to look through the keyhole, and anyway, I couldn't find out. So finally, one day, I just said, Jack, I have to know this. Do you ever take a nap when I leave the room? Oh, no, he said, oh, no. You see, but sometimes a nap takes me. You know? And I think that is the nature of naps. You can get in your pajamas and get in bed at 1 o'clock or something, but you won't go to sleep.
Right.
Naps have to do the taking.
Right.
You know? And but he was wonderfully cheerful. He had heard me say over and over and over again, as C.S. Lewis has said, oh, but you are C.S. Lewis, aren't you? So he would start this, as C.S. Lewis has said, I would like a pot of tea. As C.S. Lewis has said, you will make it. C.S. Lewis has said, I will drink it, you know. But then one day, the serious things that happened too, I found him really worried about his brother. This brings up something, a very important conversation that changed, I think, my life permanently. I didn't know it at the time, but in one way, this is the occasion, the only time, where I won an argument with him. But anyway, he was very worried about what would happen to his brother when he himself died.
Now, his brother was significantly older than he was, or at least a few years.
He was 4 years older.
4 years older.
But he was an alcoholic, and, you know, he just let money just waste away. He didn't have enough to live on himself, I think, not from his pension. So Lewis was worried about what he would live on when he himself died. I said, it's simple. He will live on your royalties.
Yeah.
And he said, but what you don't understand is that after an author dies, after about 3 years after he dies, his books trail off to nothing, and this will happen. And I said, but it won't happen to your books. And he said, well, sometime an author has a resurrection like Sir Walter Scott was having then, but this is very, very rare. Mine will stop. And I said, actually, they won't stop. And he said, what is it about this young secretary who knows things that I don't know? Why won't they stop? And I said, because your books are so good and your readers are not that stupid. I'm not sure he believed it, but I believed it.
When you said to him, your books won't disappear, and you insisted, I feel like you sort of cheated, because a large part of the reason his books did not disappear as he thought they would is absolutely and only because of your efforts. That's an historical fact, so don't argue with me.
No.
But,
well, no,
but the fact is that as good as his books are, I'm aware, and I hope you'll tell us today and in the next 2 days what your role was, the role that you played in helping his work to live on past him, because it really ends up being a huge effort. So you cheated when you said, yes, they will, because you made sure that they did. But we don't know what would have happened if you were taken out of the equation.
Well, I couldn't believe that they would stop. But then, when he died, and I went to Blackwell and saw huge quantities of his books remaindered, then I began to fear he could have been right. But I still want to stop this.
Yeah. Can you tell us about his death? Because you were not here at that time.
No,
you had gone back to...
I wasn't here. He teased me. He said he saw me, this little notebook coming out and scribbling things in it. He said, you know, the divine joke on you is going to be, I will die and you won't be here to take down my lost immortal words. And I said, in that case, I'll leave a notebook. You write them down. So anyway, then I left, but we exchanged many letters about, you know, what we're going to do when I get back. And so I retired, you know, from my job and was waiting to come back in January when he died. The same hour that President Kennedy.
I knew it was the same day, November 22nd, 1963, but I never knew it was the same hour.
Yeah. Well, one of the people who acted very quickly at that time was Austin Farrar, again, who wrote to me and said, please come back. Please come back. I feel there's a work for you waiting here. You're needed. So I did go back, and I lived with them for several months in Keble College.
With Austin Farrar?
Yeah, and then this was the time when I met Warnie.
Oh, you hadn't met him at all? He was in Ireland all that time.
Ireland.
Now, I don't quite understand. He would go to Ireland just to go to Ireland? Or because when Lewis said to you that he was an alcoholic, I wasn't aware if there was some connection with Ireland. Would he just go off on a drunk to Ireland, or would he...
As he reveals in his own biography of Brothers and Friends, in 1947 he went to Drogheda, and that's near Dublin, and he was to meet a fellow friend there, but anyway, the friend didn't show up, and he got very, very drunk and ended up in the hospital. And one of the first people to see he saw when he opened his eyes was Mother Mary Martin, the founder of the Medical Missionaries of Mary, who built that huge that hospital, Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital. So she nursed him back to health with the doctors. So she then sent for C.S. Lewis to come over there. And he went over there very worried about his brother. This is 1947. But Warnie wouldn't come home with him. He wanted to stay in this inn, the White Horse. And he had found a little Anglican church there, which he went to. And so it became his home away from home. And the nuns allowed him to go out all day and drink and yet come home at night to the hospital. And he had
a nice
a
life if you
very
can get
close
it.
friend, Major Henry, another alcoholic, another major, who had a car. And they would just go around all day long, you know, from pub to pub, little village to village. So he got used to that life. He liked it. And so this is where he was when I was with Lewis. But
Now,
anyway,
was the connection to Ireland, I just have to ask, because they had grown up in Ireland, was that Warney's connection, that he had friends from childhood?
Well, no, it's just that he loved Ireland.
Okay.
Things are much more relaxed, they were at that time in Ireland than they were in England. I mean, you couldn't very well go to a hospital in Oxford and you know, and drink all day and then go home into the hospital and sleep in the beds, you know. But they allowed it. And anyway, he came back to look after his brother, though, in November, right before his brother died. So they had a few weeks together. Anyway,
Warney came back to take care of...
Yeah. But then Warney was getting ready, when I met him, to go back to Ireland. But anyway, he had decided that he was a broke man. He didn't have enough money. And so he was moving out of the Kills, which could have been his for the rest of his life. But he thought the taxes would be so much, so he had bought a small house close by, and he was getting rid of everything. Anyway, he gave me a lot of Lewis's notebooks and papers, and he invited me to start editing Lewis's writings. So this was what made it possible for me to do what I've done for the last 50 years.
This idea that now you come back and you are deputized with this job of dealing with the works of Lewis, that there's no one else overseeing this. And sometimes I think with famous people, we assume someone's taking care of that. There's somebody to take care of that. But the idea that there was no one, the idea that his brother is so worried that he can't, I mean, what a strange irony that he's making so much money in royalties, he's giving it all away, and now his brother is worried that he can't stay in the kilns and that he's got to move out and...
Well, they both men tended to panic. I think this was in the nature of their family. But it wasn't really up to him. I mean, he was the beneficiary of Lewis's will, but it was really up to two other people, Lewis's executors, to decide who did what. And they were Owen Barfield and Cecil Harwood. And at that time, you know, because books were of copyright for 50 years after the author's death, they didn't think they could live for 50 years, but they thought I could. But they saw my interest, and they had things, their lives were very complex and busy. They were writing their own books, and they didn't want to spend all their time with their friends' books. So they were happy to see this young American, you know, who could do all this legwork and who was interested.
And what needed to be done, just so we understand? I mean, he dies. It's difficult for us to imagine what was necessary. He'd written all of his books, obviously. What was...
Well, I had heard from one of the publishers that one of the best ways to sell a new book is to bring back old books of the same author. Well, Lewis was working on a volume of his own poems when he died. And so I felt, as a tribute to him, I should finish the book that he wanted to put into print.
Okay.
So...
and who was the publisher?
Well, Jeffrey Bless.
Jeffrey Bless, okay, the famous, yeah.
I then presented them with the poems, and they were willing to publish them. And so that book came out. But then I realized that Lewis knew very little about his own writings. I mean, he didn't have copies of them. He had a copy of one of the Nárnia stories. He had very few of his own works. One time, for instance, he said, "What is your favorite poem? Can you quote your favorite poem?" I said, "I can." He said, "Well, do." So it was actually a poem from his book, Pilgrim's Regress, which I like very much. Skazens, it's called. Anyway, I quoted the poem, and he said, "Wow, that's so good. Could you write down a copy for me?" And I said, "But Jack, it's your poem." "Is it?" Well, that's not half bad, is it? You know?
I'm confused because I was under the impression that Lewis surely had what we call a photographic memory.
Well, he did, but except his own works. You know?
Or you don't think he was putting you on? Now I'm wondering,
no, I'm
because
sure
he was such a joker.
No.
Amazing. Well, it's almost like he had some kind of extreme humility, which I always, when I encounter that, I always wonder if that is God's will or if one can push it too far and be so self-abasing that they're actually doing something wrong.
Well, I think once he wrote something, he ceased to have much interest in it. He went on to something else, you know. But he can't have lied, you know. I mean, he really was thrilled to hear that poem.
That's amazing. Now, did he have any sense of, I mean, you said that he is keeping up this outrageous correspondence with dozens and scores of people around the world and spending great effort in that. Did he have any sense, do you think, that what he was writing would be collected at some point? You, if people listening don't know, you, among all the things you've done, one of the greatest things you've done is publish 3 gigantic volumes of Lewis's collected letters. A gigantic editorial effort to do that. But Lewis is pouring so much of himself into letters to strangers, practically. Do you suppose that he had any sense that they might be preserved?
I think, yes. I saw one time a note he wrote when he was in the hospital to his brother. He was worried again, you know, about what his brother would live on when he died. And in that little short note, he said, what you might do to try to keep the wolf from the door is to collect and publish some of my letters spiritual letters. And so I knew that he was aware that, you know, they
weren't junk.
You know, they were not junk.
They weren't text messages.
No. He didn't preserve letters to him. And he couldn't have told you where the letters were sent to.
Well, this is the question I want to ask, just because we're not going to do any of this in order, but since we're on this subject, in collecting his letters, surely there are many, many letters that he wrote which you wouldn't have been able to get back to publish. Do you have any...
Well, as he spent 2 hours every morning writing letters, what I have published in something like 3,500 pages, they can't represent all that he wrote. So, you know, but that's the best I can do so far.
Well, so far, yeah.
So beginning in 1967, I began collecting his letters for the Bodleian Library. So at least I had the advantage of knowing who many of the people he wrote to. So I wrote to them and asked for his letters. The Bodleian Library is not able to pay sums, you know, huge sums like that. So they have a number of people called the Friends of the Bodleian, of which I'm one. And we just collect on behalf of the Bodleian Library. So that's where most of the letters, most of them are. Right. But then they're good in Wheaton College as well. But Wheaton and the Bodleian have an exchange program. They send copies of what they have, and we send copies of what we have. You know?
It's just extra. Well, I just think that, you know, anyone who loves Lewis, he's a never-ending fountain. You don't ever have to stop reading Lewis and reading those letters. I know that I haven't read all of them yet, but I have them. You were talking about the job that was given to you, that he didn't care about his own writing. So you're presented with what at that point? Your job is what?
My job was to, I wanted his books to stay in print. But I believe, as if that publisher said, a new book helps to sell old books. Well, I began to go to the Bodleian Library and look through everything. I would take out, say, a journal like the Guardian, this is a church magazine, and start with page 1. It would take me usually 2 weeks, just turning pages, see if I could find anything by C.S. Lewis. And I did that with the Church Times, page after page after page. And I remember one time I was seated across the seat from this tall priest from Canada. And he could watch, because he was very tall, he could look down over the partition and see what I had. And one of Lewis's friends had told me, a young man, that he was pretty sure he'd seen something by Lewis in something called Men Only. Well, I got it into my head that Men Only was about deep sea fishing and wrestling with bears and things. So I ordered up, as I always did, something like, from 1930 up to 63. So they had piles of these. I mean, they brought them in 2 or 3 trolleys, and they put a stack of about 100 in front of me. Well, it weren't about deep sea fishing. Lord, no. And the priest was looking at me. And I was so embarrassed. They were pornography, if you haven't understood that yet. And anyway, I followed him out when he was just shaking his head all the time. And I followed him out, and I said, Father, it's not what you think. What do you think I think? He said. I said, I'm not reading pornography. I'm looking, actually, to see if there's an essay by C.S. Lewis. And you really expect to find him in there? And I said, well, somebody said they thought maybe there was. He said, I don't believe you. Anyway, I followed him down to St. Benet's, pleading with him. I said, just give me a chance. I'm really not what you think. He said, we'll see, because he was there the next day. And anyway, he saw me as I went through until 1963, turning every page. I didn't find anything by C.S. Lewis. But anyway, during that year, I found a lot, though. But meanwhile,
so when you say found things, so found essays or little things that had not been collected?
Oh, many, many things, including his poems, you see. One of the things that he simply didn't know about, how many poems he published and where they were. And they were mostly published in Punch magazine and other places. So I found many, many poems, and that's what was published in, October of 64.
Okay, 64. So that was the book. So that really was your initial project,
yes,
was to get out this new book
yes,
within a year of his death, and so you were looking for his poems.
Yeah,
now, that was selected poems or collected poems? What was that?
It was just poems. It was selected, but they were just called poems.
Okay, and so it wasn't definitive. It was the best that you thought.
No. But I like his poems very, very much. And at the same time, I had inherited from Warning a number of other manuscripts, such as many essays that he had read in Cambridge to various groups. And so I published a volume with Cambridge, and then a copy with Bless. But at that time, Bless soon went out of business, and I had to deal with HarperCollins, or Collins, if they were called at that time.
It was before Collins and Harper merged.
Before they merged. And the 2 people who ran it were Sir William Collins and his wife, Lady Collins.
Lady Collins.
Lady Collins.
I remember about her. I remember you telling me about her.
Well, she was the one who published the paperbacks of Lewis's works, because Bless didn't do them. And I had to go up and talk to her
in London
about this new book I had in London. I had never met anybody that grand.
As grand as Lady Collins.
Anyway, Lady Collins was in an office. They took me up and opened the door, and I saw it once. All the furniture was covered in green velvet. There was a little fire in the grate, and Lady Collins was sitting there on that green velvet chair holding a chihuahua and smoking.
Who was not covered in green velvet?
No.
Right, so.
And she was smoking Sobrani's cigarette through a jade holder.
A jade holder.
I think this is the most romantic human being I have ever laid eyes on. And then tea was brought in Georgian silver.
How did you know the silver was Georgian?
Because I knew enough about silver.
Uh-huh. I think you still do.
Actually, if she'd told me to jump through the window, I would have gladly done it. But I said, Lady Collins, you can have this new book on condition that you bring back 2 of the old books so they're out of print. And I thought this was very brave, and I thought she'd say, no, I'm not. But she said, all right, which 2 do you want me to bring back? And I said, Pilgrim's Regress and the Abolition of Man. Which one would you like first? And I said, Abolition of Man. She said, all right, you write the blurb to the back of it, and I'll bring it out.
Oh, my gosh.
Well, she was wonderful, wonderful. I loved her very, very much.
But I just want to say, and I don't care what you think, how wonderful you are that you were there with this eccentric woman, and you had enough bravado and confidence in what you were called to do to say to her that she must put out 2 new books. Those of us who love Lewis must know that we have you to thank, because I cannot imagine what might have happened. As I've heard you tell some of these stories before, it becomes eminently clear that it is not even close to inevitable that his works would have carried on. I mean, the abolition of man, which is so central to so many people's lives, it's a prophetic work, unfortunately, yes. Speaking about much that's happening today, and that's finally, many things that are finally bearing fruit today, many trends that Lewis had his finger on. Yeah. You know, the idea that you were able in 1964 to get this woman to say she'll put that book out, that's not insignificant. So I just want to annotate your comments to say that's a big deal, that as a young man you were willing to sort of put that out there, and how wonderful that she had the wisdom to see that this was a good idea. But that's I'm excited just to hear this.
Well, thank you. Sometimes it wasn't, romantic people like Lady Collins. But I remember Owen Barfield. He kept being amazed. He said, "You don't mind doing anything, do you? But you'll sacrifice anything for C.S. Lewis." But we had just received a contract for a book that I put together called God in the Dark. I given to people, Erdmans.
Now, did you come up with that title? Where does that title come from?
It comes from one of Lewis's essays. The people in the past, they believed in God or the gods, and they believed they were being judged. But for the modern man, the roles are reversed. God is in the dark, and man is on the bench.
Well, that's one of those British terms that most Americans have no idea what that means.
I know. I wonder why they even chose it.
God in the dark. It's just an old foreign term.
Well, we got the contract for them. They were willing to take it. But they were giving Lewis, and this is what really hurt me, they were giving Lewis 10% royalty. That's what you start a young man with. You start with 10%. And so Owen Barfield says, well, they're starting him as though he's nobody. And so I struck through it with a big pen and put 15%. He said, you can't possibly get away with that, can you? I said, try it. Well, let's see. I did. I'm surprised, too. But anyway...
Well, in New York, we call this chutzpah.
Yeah.
It's terrific. Do they even have a word for this in England?
What I do.
Well, chutzpah, what would they call that? I think that characteristic, maybe it took an American to be
did.
so brassy would be maybe the English word,
brassy.
a little brassy.
I was very brassy then. I'm not now. I've lost it somehow, I think, you know. But I needed to be at that time.
Yeah.
And I thought of that argument with Lewis, which I obviously have won, would you say?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. I think if there's so many things. I'm so glad we have a couple more days to continue our conversation, although I confess I hate to stop now just because there's so much that I want to ask you about these manuscripts and about Warney's bonfires where he would put the manuscripts on and rescuing manuscripts, and there's just so much. But I guess we'll get to that tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel, 11 a.m. here at St. Aldate's. I want to thank you again for being part of this, and I do mean that if you had not consented to doing this, you know, we've been emailing over the year, we wouldn't have done any of this. I said, to me, this is what must happen. The other stuff is ancillary. We've got wonderful interviews, but this I felt must happen because, as I said, to me, it's nothing less than an injustice that these stories haven't been told in a more public way. I know that many of them are out there. You've written things. You send me some things, but to hear them from you is significantly different. So thank you for being here. And we'll let you leave if you promise to return tomorrow. So thank you.
Afraid not to.
I think, yeah, no. We've only scratched the surface. That's why I said we've got to do several of these. So, but in the interest of your time and energy, we'll do it in this fashion. So, another enthusiastic Socrates in the City, Oxford. Round of applause for Walter Hooper. Thank you.